within the BCS publishing division. I'm joined today by Jonathon Wright, who is one of the co-authors of AI and software testing, a fairly recently released book on it does what it says on the tin, AI and software testing. You're joining us this afternoon for our next instalment of the BCS author webinar series featuring Jonathon Wright, where we're going to be engaging and we'll be delving into the intersection of AI and software testing, exploring how emerging technologies are reshaping traditional testing practices. So by the end of this session, you should gain some actionable insights into implementing AI within testing workflows, along with a deeper understanding of how AI is influencing the future of software development. So joining me is Jonathon Wright, who's got an extensive history and experience within AI itself. He's currently the Chief AI Technologist and Head of R&D for Agentic AI over at Eggplant, but is also a successful TED Talk speaker and podcast host at the CTO Club. So without further ado, Jonathon, over to yourself.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Charles, for that introduction. And I'm really looking forward to this session. The BCS publishing has been a great platform to get the messaging out. I was planned to be joined by a good friend of mine, Adam Leon Smith. Unfortunately, he got pulled away to a European Union AI Act event that is running currently in Paris. So he couldn't be here today, and he sends his regards. But of course, I will do my absolute best to try and fill in and look at both sides of the picture, shall we say. So I wanted to kind of extend on to that kind of introduction, just a bit of socials as well. As if you guys are wanting to connect with me onto say LinkedIn, I've got my QR code in the top right hand corner of the screen. I'm more than happy to help support and nurture the community. I sit as a BCS fellow, and I'm also on the BCS committee for the SIGIST. I think it's the third or fourth year for that. But I've been a member of the BCS since I started my career, probably back in the 90s. So, it's a great place for to really, if you wanting to kind of build your career upwards. It's also a great place to share some of these stories. And today I'm going to give you a little bit of a background into, I guess, the journey into artificial intelligence and, really that intro at the start mentioning around my TED talk about 7 years ago was on cognitive engineering and really talking about kind of the early days of machine learning and artificial intelligence, which I was based out in Silicon Valley in Santa Rosa. And my R&D team, especially for the last 10, 15 years, have been building systems which, within the AI space. So, we want to make this make this as interactive as possible. So I will put into the chat now, if you wanting to ask a question on Slido, you can just literally go to slido.com or slido.do and just type in the code BCS. That will come straight through to me. So I've got another screen open at the same time. If you're wanting to ask a question about the content that's on there, I can actually start making that quite interactive as we go along. But also I'll open that back up and you'll see the list of upvoted questions at the end. So feel free to start adding some questions in whenever you want. We want to, make this as collaborative as absolutely possible. So let's move forwards a little bit. I mentioned, I think the TED talk, and I'm here unfortunately, I'm wearing a HoloLens on stage at one of the big TechWell Star events in California, and part of it is where I am today. Actually, I'm working with the group today. Is originally the Bill and Dave establishment, which was building out testing equipment back in 1939, right? It was the original, build and test iteration, shall we call it? And 80 years on, we're still, doing that testing. It's part of our DNA, shall we say? And it's definitely from our heritage as well, and the birth of Silicon Valley. But things move on so quickly. Like I said, 7 years ago, I did this talk, really trying to position some of these core concepts in the bottom right-hand corner, which I'll be exploring today around the thinking and the learning aspect of how we do things. And I'm actually meeting later on today, or actually tomorrow now, Diego from Forrester, who's one of the analysts, who talks a lot around what he calls Turing bots, which is a nod to Alan Turing, but really it's adding traditional machine learning and artificial intelligence into generative capabilities, which obviously has kind of blurred the boundaries, I suppose, especially the last 6 or 7 years, where we've seen this cognitive reckoning, this ability to kind of surpass basic language skills, and be able to create content that feels and reads like it's been written by another human. And so this human augmentation is starting to emerge, and I think what's really interesting about that is really none of it's really changed. We've been since the 1950s, and there's a photo here with the original artworks and publications of Alan Turing from Bletchley Park, which I used to live a few miles away from, and some fundamentals that we've been talking about for the last 80 years. And then again, that's that same birth of Silicon Valley, which has really kind of moved and evolved. A lot of my teams are now working with quantum, so we've got a lot of quantum physicists and astrophysicists that are working in my R&D team. But at the same time, they're building and testing these kind of systems. So incredibly complex, from 6G waveforms to autonomous radar emulators and digital twins of simulations of complex environments. So things are exponentially increasing in complexity, and we're having to keep up at that pace. But I think part of it is this, I guess, this initial concern. And I was posting around this event earlier and saying, well, we're seeing things like the new AI literacy from the European Union AI Act coming into force the 2nd of February this year. And what does that really mean? And we've seen, more recent announcements of things like Stargate, with the 500 billion investment in AI infrastructure in the US, and then the $1.2 trillion wipeout of DeepSeek coming in, and really kind of looking at how do we bring things like chain of thought into everyday activities. Now, unfortunately, which is the problem with doing these kind of presentations, I made a prediction that we would look at targeting some of these roles by 2025 or something. And a lot of it was focusing on places like accounting and finance, and right down in the bottom corner was things like artists and musicians. And they were the protected ones, that the creativity, which we didn't need these systems to do. We wanted them to do the boring stuff. Whereas actually what we've seen is the flip way round, that actually the focus of these kind of what it shouldn't be able to do, it can do equally. Some of the roles which we've seen, which like economics, they're still very heavily human led, even though you would expect them as targets for these kind of platforms. So it feels like we've evolved quite recently over the last 6 years. But I date back 13 years ago when I stood up at an event and said, well, actually, there's 212 years spent every day just reading emails in the US. So you think about the digital grind, the activities that you're spending, the tasks that you're doing every day. How many of those are going to be automated, and then how many of those are going to be augmented by AI productivity tools? And then who's going to provide this level of AI assurance and trustworthiness of that, the quality of those responses, of replying back for emails for you, is going to be at the level, the critical level that it needs to be able to outperform a human. And I guess, again, these are areas that we still don't know whether or not you're going to get to, but we definitely got some predictions that these numbers are going to definitely surpass our expectations. And I was here I was at DeepMind, actually. This is in London, and I put these numbers, which are very, marketing kind of face out there about things like quantum and, talking about things like generative AI and, this kind of wild remark around the fact that we could see 35% of all our daily activities be replaced by automated systems. And actually, the reality is not that far off. We're in 2025 now. We're all starting to use these tools. I'm sure for all of the people that have joined on the live stream at the moment, I saw Alec and a few other people that I know quite well, who've probably seen various versions of this throughout last year. They probably would agree that you've started using things like cursor.com if you're using the free code generation tools within your IDEs, or you might be using, Copilot for GitHub. You're seeing developers definitely starting to use these tools more. And then you've seen, new productivity tools that are coming out as well. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, I'm using some of these in my day-to-day activities. But I'd probably agree with Diego, who, like I said, I'm meeting up with later on today, around some of these, these gains. And we've seen people like GitHub and GitLab say, yes, you can get 15-20% productivity, but there's probably an exponential number of code quality, which is kind of a direct relation to that, which you're probably going to start seeing the fallout of. And then secondly, you're probably going to also see the fact that you're unlocking benefits by providing these Turing bots or these agentic AIs to certain capabilities, development, testing, business analysis, requirements, and, usability and design. But actually, really, the benefit is to unlock the greater productivity where these agentic-based systems across the SDLC. And what you can't really see behind me, but because it's thankfully blurred out. But I'm going to challenge the fact that it's beyond the SDLC. It's actually now into engineering and the business. And you could kind of say, well, actually, citizen testers are going to be people who are actually at the coal face using, the manufacturing, production, logistics systems, and they're wanting to get involved and utilize these agentic platforms. So I think there's a lot of kind of questions around where are we going with this technology, and then also how do you provide the level of engineering reliability over the top of some of these systems, because I'm guessing for most of the people who have used this kind of technology, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, you've probably seen things like hallucinations, you've got inconsistency, losing the trustworthiness of the outcome, and the idea that this is potentially the making moral decision making based on some kind of model. This is a concern, and obviously, is something that I think, the community, especially the European Union, and I'm part of the AI Alliance, who put out some foundations around, trustworthy frameworks and ethics frameworks, is, how much should be done by a machine and how much should be, still done by humans in the loop. And I'm an advocate for this, and I think, there's definitely, it's always going to be human led, but actually kind of my 2 cents to this is that you're going to see more and more subject matter experts, right? You're going to see more and more people who are augmenting the knowledge of these systems. So you might have a domain specific model that might be incredibly good from a medical or astrophysicist kind of skill, but you need to augment them with people who actually know their way around that business to be able to validate that the outcome is what's expected. Taking the training wheels off, and those guardrails really are going to take a bit of time. And there's a concern of deregulation of some of these upcoming standards, which I'm going to go through today, and some of the policies and compliance and regulatory stuff that's coming in across Europe, the UK, and the US. That the pace of innovation is probably not taking all of these into consideration. So incredibly challenging. And I think we're just at the tip of starting to leverage some of these capabilities. And I think people quite quickly, whenever there's a new wave of technology or terminology, they'll quickly look into the past and go, well, in essence, agentic AI, agentic, do you mean agent-based? Well, we've seen bots around for the last 10, 15 years, and we've seen, we've all seen things in the past where, Microsoft, bot framework, how good it is and how well it performs, and maybe some of the challenges of rolling out some of this technology. But agentic is definitely not that. Agentic actually came from large agentic models, which has now been rebadged as large action models. But I genuinely believe, we are seeing a step change, and we're seeing an exponential growth in this technology. And I'm hoping that this moves away from maybe this generative bubble that we've been in for the last 5 years, where we're believing, large language models might be the solution to the problem, when really they're just a subset of natural language processing, natural language understanding that really does have an application, but actually more traditional, deep learning techniques are probably more advantageous for, more complex tasks, right? Where, not everything has a simple conversational interface. And that's what it is, right? Part of it is these touch points, and I'd like to think of those touch points as interactions that we would have as humans, and also a combination of both. I'm going to call it for a second technical and domain or contextual understanding, but each one of those points is to a certain scale. I had a friend. We did a live stream last week or the week before with a good friend of mine, Jason Arbon, who wrote the book How Google Tests, and he was in a quite heated discussion with a guy called Chris Ambler, who's just finished his psychology degree and applying it to a book that he's writing on artificial intelligence. And he was kind of arguing about, nudge theory and all of the basic foundational concepts of psychology, and then, putting an age on how, mature at making, moral decision making some of these systems are. And he argued that it's in its teenage phase of not really having that level of responsibility and ethics framework. Whereas a lot of us, and I'm not going to get into ethics because it's incredibly complex and also incredibly challenging and controversial. But, part of it is I don't think we are at the point that we need to be. And I think partly we're lacking in certain areas. And I think governance, AI governance and assurance is definitely one area, which I wanted to kind of drill into in a bit more detail, because I know, and hopefully a few people I've seen who've joined, their roles are starting to pivot. What was maybe quality engineering 5, 10 years ago, starting to go into these new roles around, well, how do I assure these systems are working? So AI assurance, is one of my big bets for 2025. But I also believe that, depending on your role and the part of the phase of whether or not you're doing that thinking, the creation, or the learning aspect, there's going to be lots of different activities and use cases, depending on where you're coming in and your point of view and your collaboration in that SDLC and beyond SDLC landscape. Because I think, we're very good at looking at, especially even with the British Computer Society, we're very good at looking at IT for IT, right? We're very good at understanding that we're foundationally an engineering discipline, and you'd probably join the BCS to become a chartered engineer or an equivalent. Like my father was one of the was a chartered engineer for the IEEE back in the 70s, 80s, and part of the foundational CEng certificate was to kind of give you that kind of viewpoint that you've got the hands-on experience and the knowledge and the wisdom that's associated with progressing through your personal development. And I think part of that is more valid than ever. And it's some of the stats which are quite terrifying, with average age of a tester or amount of experience being less than 5 years, and some of the formalized training of those being actually in the weeks numbers. It's that level of expertise and heritage seems to be disappearing from our industry, and actually things like the BCS and the IEEE are really about bringing some of that engineering rigor back into it. I always kind of quote Tom Gill when you look at things like requirements engineering, right, back from 1970s with books that he's done in that area, and even things like language, which was an unambiguous business language, because English is great for writing poetry, but it's not great for being ambiguous, and it's less structured than some other more modern languages, or even some more traditional languages that have more structure. So you may play a part in here, or multiple parts within this landscape of whether or not you're closer to the business or you're closer to the customers. But whatever part you're doing, there's an activity which you're involved with. And like I said, we've seen iterations of this for the British Computer Society event we ran last year. Dorothy Graham, who was a mentor of mine back in the 90s, and I've done a number of books with, she kind of was the first engineer to do test automation back in 1970s for Bell Labs. She wrote a book called Document Inspection, which was incredibly popular because it helped provide some structure around those large software requirement specification documents, and being able to give the rigor. I did bring it back in for a project, for an MIT project during COVID, and she was ripping these MIT students to pieces, just really kind of talking about the analysis and planning stage way before we get into this creation and coding landscape. So I think there's a lot to be said about bringing along the journey and of this knowledge, and that you can't just solve everything with implied knowledge from these new technologies. And you probably can see for the key nine people on there, that we've got some mentions there of things like large action models, things like Omniparser from Microsoft, and things like UFO from Microsoft, both operational frameworks for large agentic models, but also things like OpenLAM and XLAM coming from Salesforce last year. There was a lot of exponential growth. And then you saw more recent announcements, things like AI Operator, teased by Sam's team from OpenAI. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about where that's going and which direction, but also things like Claude computer use. We're seeing a lot more applications of things like the DeepSeek, capability, but actually integrated into how it treats business application landscapes. I think many of you, I know John Feezy's just added a question on the live stream. But for many of you, you probably already heard of things like Microsoft Graph, which doesn't create graphs. It actually is a large knowledge graph where if you turn on your Fiddler or your Wireshark now, you'll see if you're in an O365 or E365 tenanted environments, it's starting to push information in GraphQL format to this centralized knowledge base. Is it starting to try and, in essence, process mine what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, so that it can look at turning some of that, using things like Copilot Studio, into activities that can be automated and could be turned into agentic AI endpoints. I think, to John's question around, I'm going to use the word bad practices because he's used the word bad practices, right? I think, we've always been ambassadors for quality. And I think, we've always maybe had the bad end of it, in the sense of, quality is everyone's responsibility. And by saying that, actually, it's nobody's responsibility. But maybe we've not been informed enough to be able to make those kind of decisions and push back with some of the good practices that should be adopted with the information that's required. So to John's point, if you're asking about code coverage metrics or something like that, you might use something like SonarQube to go in and have a conversation and look at code smells and, bring all these metrics to try and push maybe some of the questions back downstream to say, okay, we need to really think about how we do peer reviews, and, we're not just using Copilot GitHub, building it and then deploying it. We're really putting that design rigor and those enterprise architecture principles back into place. But you see things like and advancements, things like Diff Blue, which is a great Oxford startup company, which can automatically generate all your unit tests for Java. And you kind of say, well, we're going to see this. We're going to see, tools that accelerate this. And what does that really mean? Does it build more confidence? Is there any more value in what we're doing? But we definitely need to be more scientific around how we provide actionable insights and feed them back to every stage, whether it's the idealization stage to say, well, actually, that hypothesis that you had for providing free coffee into your chain of stores, actually, there's no scientific hypothesis, data around modeling and creating a simulation to prove that's going to make buyers buy any more products. So each part should always be tested and validated. So I kind of don't want to derail this, and I know we've got half an hour or something left, but I wanted to kind of just drop this in. And for those who follow me on LinkedIn, so it's linkedin.com/in, and then the username's automation. You'll probably see the last comment I made was to someone saying, AI literacy. What is AI literacy and why is it so important? And then, they actually started talking about fake news, and then for a post which looked like it had been generated by a chat GPT kind of system. And their recommendation at the end of it was, don't listen to what people say on LinkedIn. If you want to know about AI literacy, go to ChatGPT and ask it. And I was thinking, I think you might have got the whole process completely wrong. AI literacy is really the enablement and training of your staff to be able to allow them to be AI literate, be able to actually use these systems and not use ChatGPT to actually make more sensible decisions. And I think we've got a wave, which I'd hate to say that I might have contributed to, of people believing that prompt engineering might be the way forwards, when actually what that does is it puts the engineering and the responsibility onto the end user. And actually, you don't want shadow prompting. You don't want people creating these elaborate prompts that you are, subjected to responses that maybe you're asking it to create a legal document, and you're passing it in some maybe sensitive information and into a public, large language model or GPT. That is definitely against everything which we were trying to build within this European AI Act and guidance, and I'd recommend, if you haven't seen it already, especially gov.uk, if you just type gov.uk and then AI assurance, there's a policy that came out last February, which is a guideline around, governance and frameworks that you can operate within your organization to enable people to give them, the appropriate levels that they need to do their work, because you don't want them to be asking ChatGPT. You want to be able to kind of bring some of that structure back in and that governance back into the organization and provide them with the capabilities. Even the organization, I won't mention who, they bring out these generative AI guidelines internally, and they still say, well, if you're in HR, use this, pass in people's CVs, and a lot of that's got PII and GDPR sensitive data. You shouldn't be passing that to a public, GPT. And then people argue, well, you just use Copilot within the Microsoft tenanted landscape, and that still is a step up. But again, every time you look at a SaaS-based solution, you're responsible for the security around that. So you still need to make sure, how that data is being retained, and what information you're using and who has access to that still follows those basic data privacy and governance policies. So I think running with scissors and trying to get in, these kind of questions around, is there a solution to any of these problems? Of course, I'm thankful for Charles for throwing in that 20% off voucher, and I was very impressed when I saw this, and then slightly disappointed when I ordered 3 copies the other day, and they got delivered without this independent press awards sticker in the bottom right hand corner. But Adam, who couldn't be here today, and Rex Black, if you remember, back in the original ISEB days before ISTQB was a real thing. Again, back to kind of Peter's question around Gilb and Graham, putting some of those original, software testing accreditations together. part of it is this group was the working group for the ISO 29119 Part 11 for, building AI, at what we call AI infused systems. There was some great work in there. Obviously, I talk about the MIT COVID project in there, which Dorothy Graham actually was involved with. But I also talk about different frameworks that I personally looked at of how to measure these systems. Of course, Adam, it's probably got 5 or 6 steps slightly in front of this, in the sense if he's built out systems that will identify data drift over time. They'll really measure some of the basic stuff that you would expect any good AI engineer to be doing anyway, but visualizing that and really providing the auditability of these systems. Because wrapping something around there, I genuinely believe is going to be a future opportunity for everyone who's like, I know John Feasy, I've got for maybe 20 years, who've in the test and QA space, but actually are evolving into, well, now we've got to assure that these AI infused systems are doing what they should be doing, and they're doing what they should be doing today. But as the algorithms evolve and the models change, that they still do what they need to do in 5, 10 years or even longer. I don't know how long the shelf life of these systems are, but I know there's going to be some serious rigor around this. And you might quickly say, well, let's go back to the new ISO 42001 framework from 2023 and say, okay, well, let's start putting an AI policy in. Let's start doing an AI risk assessment. Let's start looking at, some of these evaluation metrics and auditing systems that you can do. And, for anybody who wants to type that into Google, you'll probably find that there's a sample of the 42,000, which gives you everything you need to know. It is a great read as a recommendation, but you'll also be fairly kind of concerned when you realize that actually there's only about 7 or 8 large organizations that are 42,000 compliant, in the same way you would expect with some of the other quality standards that are the 9001s kind of stuff in the past, which companies are now bread and butter, right? It's a process that they go through it. Equally, for those who have been keen at looking at the gov.uk landscape and our PM, of course, there was a publication earlier this last week, actually, which mentioned that this new AI governance that we're trying to put in, there's only 47 UK organizations that would actually feel like they're actually at day one of that journey. And so therefore we've got however many more companies on Companies House that are probably not at the position that they need to be. Again, of course, I'd recommend going through and looking at the ISO 29000 and 29119 standards as well, because there's a lot of great stuff in around transparency and how to test these systems. And I think there's some great stuff, but you could also just check out the book. I think that'd probably help you accelerate your journey to get there. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and unfortunately, I mentioned, we've got our own tool usage guideline policy around, well, how do you use, Copilot? How do you use, GitHub? And some basic foundational stuff. But I had this quite interesting conversation with a number of chief AI officers, which are starting to emerge as a new job title, yesterday, who was kind of saying, well, they're concerned that, the IT for IT's sake, there's these teams that are building, let's call them AI labs capabilities, but the governance is starting and the frameworks are really starting from within IT. They're not brought in from an enterprise AI perspective of no longer just IT, but all the way to IT operations, to engineering, to marketing, logistics, across the entire landscape, and saying, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make sure that we're not found that we've done something which could be seen as incredibly ethically incorrect? And also, there's this new AI liability coming out in a few months' time, which could potentially, get them in a bit of a bad position. I'll skip back to that slide because it was nice and complex. But this new AI liability directive, which if you've not checked it out, again, I'd recommend having a little look. I recommend going to AI Standards Hub, which allows you to download all of these documents. But actually, what's really good about the AI Standards Hub is you can also search by industry. So if you're in a specific industry, aerospace, education, financial services, it will tell you the appropriate legislation and compliance that you've got to follow, but then allow you to download them all. So you can read through and, at least inform your organization around which ones they should be looking at and when are these milestones that you need to be thinking about. So, definitely, there's some big steps, in here, you can see that there's an enforcement piece that's coming through. And actually some of those, which was on the previous slide, which I didn't really go through in too much detail, is they'll be able to find liability if you're using, AI in a way that's maybe manipulating or doing something that's illegal. That's the first wave of these things, which I think are really going to kind of crack down on those low level people. But then later on, I think you're going to start seeing more generic ones, more kind of, okay, what does this really mean for retail or some organizations that are less relevant to these kind of massive controversial topics. But I'll go back to this slide for a second and kind of just throw in this kind of question around what we've personally got. So my team, we've got about 12 engineers based out in Madrid. I've got a team based in Santa Clara and Santa Rosa, and we've also got a team based out in Penang, and another team based out in Cambridge and Oxford. Part of them is we have to follow the Executive Order 1110, which has been put in place under Biden's leadership just over a year ago. And so we already have to do a certain amount of auditability on our systems that we're building. So Keysight.ai, under Tamway, who was one of the heads of Apple AI, he's come across and tried to put a lot of this process in place. Now, interestingly, some of these are some of the questions that actually my team got around Lyme and explainability of what we're doing, measurements of what we're actually measuring, and then also more importantly, we're following the national standards AI risk framework, which is very big in the US, but you have the equivalent ones within the UK and also Europe, which I think are incredibly important as well. So whichever framework you're using, you still need to have the evidence to be able to show that you are building things ethically. And Peter, I know you mentioned about are we building things in the right way? I've seen a lot of these organizations that are embracing AI labs in the same way that used to 10, 15 years ago, embraced innovation labs. They'll put it out to the organization, say, "Oh, try something new," and they'll go off and tinker with something and go, "Yeah, this is a really good use case for us," and it might be something unique to their industry, and so they'll go off and build it. And they'll build it, and then they'll either use it in an operational sense, or maybe it'll get as far as a customer, right? And we've all heard the stories of insurance companies, having, talking to an AI, and then negotiating the price of the policy down, or doing some exceptions that hit the headlines. But part of it is these tools probably aren't at the level that they need to be, over that 90% grade, which, ensures that, yes, they might outperform a human. That's 9 out of the 10 times correct. But actually, when you build it into a system which you've got liability for, then you've got some real questions around, if it's making some of these decisions, those edge cases could potentially be devastating from an organizational perspective. So I do go back to, and this is Peter's question as well, is that I do feel like we still need those foundational engineering, Tom Gilb, Graham kind of, foundational stuff around asking the right questions. But we need to operate them in this new world. We need to be able to frame them into, well, where's the data coming from? Where's your training data set coming from? What's the set that you're going to be using to validate it? Where's this? How's this being created? Are you using synthetic data generation to create these large sets of data to prove it? Because we haven't got that information, available. And we could go back to saying the old days of saying, well, we're just taking a snapshot of production and obfuscating the data and then synthetically generating, a billion different permutations. And you kind of sit there going, you're right, but maybe from a security perspective, there's concerns around that. Now, for those who've been keeping up with the times, I suppose, with the Microsoft tour, which is happening at the moment, is part of it is they roll out another framework. And if you were a management consultancy company, you've probably seen this same thing, whether it be big data across it or digital transformation. It feels like we're just hitting another wave of, adding the word AI and then going through that same kind of governance strategy where you're thinking, well, this is just sensible, right? Even to the point where I kind of giggled when the Microsoft started talking about centers of, actually they called them excellence, but I'm going to really kind of, you know, kind of avoid that one. Um, and I think, Peter, again, to your point, they are, people are wanting to build this stuff really quickly, but they're also wanting the big starting to be measured by them, right? So when they roll out productivity, I've been talking to maybe 5 of the big banks, even the centralized bank of the country, who are all very much like, well, we have to show we're using these AI productivities because we need to, keep up with the pace of developers using these new tools, or they need to bring a new solution into market as soon as possible, running with scissors to prove out that that's a justification that they need to have this AI governance and frameworks and assurance teams and all this other stuff. And I think that only ends up looking, falling, exploding it back on you because, we saw this with digital transformation and the gov.uk's kind of policy saying, well, let's build stuff with open source very quickly. And then we saw the petitions website getting that DOS attack when Brexit happened, and it brought it down. And they said, oh, well, that was because we built that platform in 6 weeks and it was a success story and it was quick. And you're saying, well, it didn't have the level of SOC 2 kind of security prowess. We probably didn't have all of those fantastic tools for OWASP testing and transposing the directory structures and all this vulnerability testing, because we wanted to get at something out fast and we wanted to be the success team that said it didn't take us 2 years and 20 millions of tax dollars, money to bring out a petition website, but we never foresaw the size of the demand for that product. So, I think we've learned these lessons a number of different times, and I'd say actually we probably learned the lessons. I've learned the lessons even more times round. This is back in 2022, and I stood up in front of Gartner and said to them, look, I can do autonomous code generation of automation, and I can have these little chat, clippy kind of assistants, and I can take natural language and generate tests. And people just said, well, that's, we're not interested about that because in actual fact, just because you can do something faster doesn't mean that you're doing the right thing, right? And I think that goes back to kind of what John and Peter are both saying. It's like just because you can at a faster pace do something doesn't mean that it's the right thing. And actually, when we go back to that kind of initial question of saying, well, what is the right thing? We go back to saying, well, what is the problem we're trying to solve, right? It's actually probably, which is why, but we commissioned this with IDC. We realized that actually the hard part of testing, or a time-consuming component, which could be very supported by this kind of technology, is things like test design. It's fine automating something, but really that's the last 5%, right? Actually, 90% of the tasks that a tester's doing are tasks that are probably not automatable, asking questions, having conversations, going through and, being the ambassador and, playing devil's advocate and all this kind of stuff that actually, making sure that you've got the right coverage, you've got the right tests, they're designed, they've got the right level of rigor to them, you're pushing back the right questions, is actually where we want to be. And so, even though at the tip, the cusp of the wave is this huge enthusiasm for, generative AI, and, I think even down here, you can probably see there's some AI engineering on the cusp on its way up for, generative AI and responsible AI. Yes, it's at the peak of flexion. It feels like everyone needs to do, an event like this because they want to, get on the bandwagon. But in actual fact, agentic or AI first platforms is more about building systems that you're not just retrofitting AI on for the sake of AI. You're actually thinking about, well, what are the new use cases? And this came from Jason Arbon, this slide, but I think what he's trying to indicate is that actually the amount of testing that's required is going to be the same amount of testing in 5 years' time. There's just going to be a lot more that's going to be done. And therefore, the only way you're going to be able to keep up with that pace is by allowing a certain amount of flexibility of AI augmentation to allow us to support our job. It's not going to go away. The tester in the loop is still going to be there. The difference is it's going to really pivot to be more assisted. And actually your ability, and Jason said this at the end of the talk, is that the future ones, the people who've got jobs in 10 years' time, will be able to deal with 10 or 15 different sources of information coming in, feeding them with data, and they'll be able to understand it, apply their domain and context and their trade to be able to respond to them. They won't be just, creating, let's call it, exploring a system and then, not documenting it, not understanding it, not evaluating it, not being scientific, not applying that engineering pizzazz to it. And so, again, I will, I know we've got about 10, 11 minutes, and I'm asking, ask questions into the chat because I want to make it really interactive, but I also want to leave you with some stuff that, feels like you are going to, walk away and go, okay, there's 5 things I can go off and do now. And apart from buy the book, of course, but I'd say that as otherwise you wouldn't be here, right? But, like I said, people kind of, as soon as I said the word agentic, and I said, agentic's going to be the biggest thing of the year, is agentic just agents? And, Peter's question around, well, that's great, but how does it test ETL systems, right? Enhanced transformer load. I remember Tim Cook, and he's sitting down talking to him about trying to solve his problem, which was in essence every transaction on the App Store is in essence an SAP transaction, and it takes him 5 days to find out what people are buying on the App Store, and that's because he's doing a whole stack of 200,000 transactions. I think it's a minute, or 10 minutes. I can't remember what the period of time was. It takes such a long time to consolidate all that information to a point where he's got this view of, well, TikTok's the biggest thing, but actually now it's DeepSeek, right? So part of it is they don't know your ETL systems. They're not like the process mining tools which you saw with RPA. Actually, understanding your TIBCO messaging and your Kafka messages and your database transactions, they're not looking at that level, but that's what they wanted to do. That's what Sam has been saying, the call that we were on with Sam, he said that exact same thing, is they're trying to understand what people are doing. Now, what does that mean? Well, my laptop, which I'm using at the moment, should have had recall on it, and recall was taking screenshots of all the systems I'm running. So Peter's building an on-prem system written in, Lisp or something. How do I know what that looks like? How do I know what flows people go through it? It's because it wants to observe the systems that you're actually doing and then apply chain of thought and, visualization of thought, give it techniques that it understands the contextual complexity of these legacy systems. So part of it is it does feel bigger, and it is something bigger. It's not about putting in automation, again, in another disguise, is actually it needs to be all of this governance, this, safety checks, making sure, should it have access to these systems, these back-end systems, these enterprise integrations of, the COBOL systems running 90% of business transactions. Yes, should it be reading code? All these kind of questions that it's going to try and to evolve. But the reason why it's trying to do it is to streamline things. If you think, why are they spending 500 billion on AI infrastructures? Because they need that compute level to be able to actually, protect the the GDP of the country, right? It's getting to that level. So agentic is going to help with short-term, long-term memory, reasoning, understanding, and being able to allow it to understand business context, i.e., what's happening within your company, which could be structured. If it's ETLs, it might be structured under Control M or something. It could be Microsoft Graph, which is already stealing your data, which you don't know about. It might be vector stores of structured, unstructured data just dumped into something, or it might be structured data that's coming in from something like, GraphQL or, Neo4j or something. So part of it is it's already trying to understand the business context, and it's already trying to understand the physical environment, and understand and interpret the actual systems that are interacting with each other. So it's already on this journey. It's already trying to do that, and it's in essence dividing and conquering and having shared recall understanding of how those systems work. So, I'm going to flip through these last few because I just want you to have a few takeaways and a few things that hopefully you can go off and do. But, when I was running these workshops last year, and I was talking about things like large language model routers and large action models, and how they play. So I use the word Babel fish in here, but how do I allow people to, take in an input, which could be an ETL or a process document, and then splurt out some logic or model or representation of a digital twin or a digital twin definition language, whatever that might be, different inputs and different outputs, all being able to be, transposed and then understood by some kind of clippy little waggy dog system to allow you to talk to the right people, saying, should this ETL actually happen, or should it be, something else? But, well, what's happened, and I will paste in if I get the chance at the end of it, otherwise I will add it into the BCS, into the Slido at the end. But you can all Google Open Operator today, and I did this demo literally to my CEO the other day, and I said, look, you can go to Open Operator, you can type in, okay, just go in, go onto JP Morgan, which is what it's doing on the bottom right, and go and tell me the investment profile for company X, and it will just go off using neuro-symbolic languaging or abstraction to be able to go off and then go and use chain of thought to go and navigate these systems that, as Peter said, never been seen before. But it's using a vision model like YOLO, you only look once, to version 12, I think it's the latest version, to say, what am I seeing? Well, actually, I'm seeing a fairly basic application. I can navigate through this. I can read the documentation. I can read the docusaurus. I can read how to do two-hour factorial authentication. I can work that out myself. So part of it is whether it's a desktop on the left-hand side with Claude Computer use, or it's operator on the right-hand side, which is going to be much, much bigger. All it's really doing is applying chain of thought, which is nothing new. Again, it's 18 months behind what everybody else has done. The difference is you can literally type in Olama and then run DeepSeek, and it'll pull it down onto your local machine. And for 1 second, it will feel like it's doing cognitive reasoning. It's saying, well, if I was John Feasy and I had a team of 100 engineers, what shall I tell them to do around AI literacy? And it would go, well, first I'd come up with a policy document, then I'd articulate it in a dojo to the whole team, then I'd look at some training, and then I'd look at maybe, my key people, I'd do some certification. It's going through these different thought processes. But in all fairness, all it's doing is prompt chaining and prompt threading. And, it's, yes, it's using reinforcing learning on the final stage of the Lang part of the, the tool. But, in all fairness, this is not super sophisticated. And actually, yes, it runs on a Raspberry Pi because literally it's, it's a 4 to 8 billion model that's performing more like a 12, but actually you really need a mix of experts, 110 billion times by 12, before you're really doing anything of any real use, because this isn't an expert. It can't create syntax, it can't create code. You've got models, you need a large large language model router to be able to route to the correct model or a fine-tuned domain model. So I'm not going to show you this slide, but I think I was wrong last year because I kind of didn't predict that actually domain-specific models, i.e. industry-specific models, were going to be such a big thing. But it did push back on me on to say, well, actually, the whole point of having the BCS and the BSI and the IEEE and the ISO and ISTQB and all of these things is these are all sources of knowledge, whether or not it's the trade of testing or trade of development or design or European Accessibility Act, which is coming out in June, whatever that might be, you need to have these different sources of information to be able to allow it to be able to understand not only your domain of what you're doing, but also the industry that you're doing in it. So this thing is evolving, and it's evolving at an exponential rate. So expect it to continue to evolve. And I'm going to leave this last slide on with a few questions, because I know they'll want to close this thing off. But I genuinely believe, if I was going to be a better in the next kind of few weeks, I was saying to you, AI assurance is probably the biggest next big thing. Vision models and computer use agents are just exponential, right? This UI TOR system now can support any desktop, any system with a fairly high accuracy, and it's just getting better and better, right? And then on top of that, these operators, chain of thought, the testing of these AI infused systems. So go off and read the book on artificial intelligence for software testing. The ability to start adding a lab, a harness round to all of this, and then also be able to specialize. I genuinely believe this stuff is the future, and you need to be ready to embrace it. So with that, I'm going to let Charles kind of come back in for a second while he's probably thinking to himself, crikey, Jonathan, you've got 2 minutes left. How on earth are you going to potentially close this one down? But I've answered most of all the questions in Slido. Did you want to add any kind of closing thoughts apart from thanks for so many slides and thanks for the fish?
Well, Jonathan, thanks for the fish and so many slides. No, that was a really engaging walkthrough of a huge amount of what you've learned, I think, over the years, and what's likely to come in the recent future as well. So yeah, huge amount of information. I hope it's been useful for everybody else. And Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We've additionally got some additional webinar videos coming up every other week as part of the webinar series. So please do check back either on email or on the Eventbrite, or stay tuned via our LinkedIn page as well. As Jonathan previously mentioned, you can pick up Jonathan's book, AI and Software Testing. In the comment section, there is a link and a code for 20% off exclusive to this webinar as well. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Jonathan, for all of your support and contribution. And we look forward to seeing you all in the next one.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.